In 1933, ground beef cost 9 cents a pound at the corner butcher. A mother with 4 kids and a nearly empty pantry could turn 1 pound into 3 days of meals, and the people who ate those meals never once felt like they were eating poor. Number 8 on this list looks so unremarkable that food historians almost missed it entirely. Then they found it in 6 different White House kitchen records from the 1950s and 60s. Number 7 vanished so completely from American tables that most people under 60 have never heard its name. But women who made it called it their best weeknight meal. And number 1, the dish every family made, every family argued about, and every family got wrong. Food scientists recently confirmed that the version your grandmother made without measuring anything was nutritionally superior to the lean, low-fat versions that replaced it. These 25 recipes were not invented by chefs. They were engineered by women who couldn't afford mistakes, using the one ingredient that was always within reach. And the convenience food industry spent decades making sure you forgot just how good that ingredient could be. Hit subscribe before we start. What you're about to see might be the most important cooking knowledge hiding in plain sight. Let's count down the 25 forgotten ground beef recipes that kept families fed. 25. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Long before anyone called it comfort food, Eastern European grandmothers brought this recipe to America in steamer trunks and apron pockets, and it spread quietly across the Midwest like a secret worth keeping. By the time the 1960s arrived, stuffed cabbage rolls had found their way into church basements from Milwaukee to Pittsburgh, and into the weekly rotation of women who knew how to make a pound of beef feed 8 people without anyone feeling shortchanged. You'd peel the leaves off a head of cabbage after softening it in boiling water, careful not to tear them. The fill-in was ground beef mixed with cooked rice, minced onion, salt, pepper, simple enough that a 12-year-old could help. Each leaf got a neat bundle of filling tucked inside and folded over like a small package, then laid in rows in a heavy pot. Over them went a sauce of canned tomatoes, sometimes with a spoonful of brown sugar stirred in, because that little sweetness against the savory beef was the whole point. They simmered low and slow for 2 hours. You couldn't rush them. The cabbage turned silky, the filling swelled, the tomato sauce reduced into something almost glossy. The whole house smelled like a hug. Women who made these didn't think of themselves as cooks doing anything special. They thought of themselves as feeding their families. That was all. That was enough. 24. Depression-era beef and gravy on toast. This one goes back further than the 1950s or 60s, all the way to the years when families lost everything and had to figure out how to keep going anyway. SOS, some called it, though that name came from the military canteens where a generation of young men first tasted it during wartime. By the time those men came home and started families of their own, their wives were making versions of it in small kitchens across America, and nobody thought of it as a hardship meal anymore. It was just dinner. Brown a little ground beef, make a simple white gravy right in the same pan, butter, flour, milk, salt, and pepper. Pour it over white toast. That was it. 4 ingredients, less than 15 minutes. $1 could stretch it to feed the whole table with money left over. What's remarkable is that it tasted far better than it had any right to. The pepper in the gravy, the way the toast soaked up just enough without going completely soft, the richness of the beef underneath. It was modest food that somehow satisfied completely. A lot of women who grew up eating this made it for their own children without ever explaining where it came from. It didn't need an explanation. It just needed to be eaten. 23. HOBO casserole. Nobody remembers exactly who named it, but every family seems to remember eating it. Hobo casserole was the kind of recipe that got passed around neighborhood to neighborhood, written on index cards in loopy cursive, tucked into community cookbooks between the Jell-O salads and the church potluck listings. It was humble food with an honest name, and it fed a lot of people through a lot of hard months. The concept was pure simplicity. Layer sliced raw potatoes on the bottom of a baking dish. Brown ground beef with onion and spread it over the top. Pour over a can of cream of mushroom soup thinned with a little milk. Cover it tightly with foil and put it in the oven for an hour. Some women added sliced carrots. Some put in frozen peas for the last 15 minutes. Some topped it with shredded cheddar cheese and slid it back in uncovered just long enough to brown. What came out was a bubbling, creamy, deeply satisfying casserole where the potatoes had absorbed every bit of the beefy, mushroomy liquid and turned completely tender. The kind of thing you spooned out in generous portions and never once thought about the cost per serving. You just thought about whether there was enough left for tomorrow. You know, most of these recipes you'd expect. Ground beef, potatoes, a can of soup, the classics. But we're coming up on a dish that stumped almost every woman we mentioned it to. Number 11 on this list was served at White House state dinners in the early 1960s, made with ground beef. Most people have never heard of it. Keep watching. 22. Beef noodle bake. Every family had a version of this. The name changed depending on what part of the country you lived in. Some called it beef noodle casserole. Some called it simply the Tuesday dish. But the smell was the same everywhere. Egg noodles, browned ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and a generous handful of whatever cheese was in the refrigerator. It smelled like the end of a long day finally being over. The technique was forgiven in a way that complicated recipes never are. You cooked the egg noodles until just barely done, because they'd keep cooking in the oven and you didn't want mush. The beef got browned with a little onion and drained. Everything went into a large bowl, soup and all, stirred together until it looked almost too simple to be worth eating. Then into a buttered casserole dish, cheese on top, foil over that, and 40 minutes in the oven. The last 10 minutes you took the foil off and let the cheese brown at the edges. Those edges, slightly crisp, slightly caramelized, were what people fought over. It was the kind of dish that got better as it sat, that tasted even more like itself the next day, warmed up in a small pan on the stove. Nobody ever complained about leftovers when this was what was waiting. 21. Beef and bean soup. There's a reason this soup showed up on the stove every single winter for decades. It wasn't fashion, it wasn't a trend. It was the fact that a soup pot full of ground beef, white beans, diced tomatoes, and whatever vegetables needed using up could feed a family of 5 for 2 days on less than $2. In the 1950s and 60s, that wasn't a small thing. That was the difference between making it and not making it. You'd brown the beef first, breaking it fine so it dispersed through the broth rather than clumping. In went diced onion, celery, a couple of carrots cut small enough to cook through, canned tomatoes, a can of white beans, Great Northerns were popular, beef broth or water with a bouillon cube dissolved in it, salt, pepper, a bay leaf if you had one, dried thyme if you were feeling particular about it. It simmered for 40 minutes on the back burner while everything else in the house happened around it. Homework got done, laundry got folded, the 6 o'clock news played in the other room, and at the end of all of it, there was hot soup and a plate of saltine crackers on the table. Simple doesn't have to mean less. Sometimes simple is exactly what love looks like. 20. Skillet, cornbread, and beef. This one came out of the South and never really left. Cast iron skillets were essential kitchen tools long before food magazines started calling them vintage, and the women who cooked on them daily knew something those magazines never quite captured. A well-seasoned cast-iron skillet makes everything taste better, especially cornbread baked right on top of spiced ground beef. You'd make the beef layer first, browned with onion, green pepper, canned tomatoes, a little chili powder. Nothing too spicy, just enough warmth to know it was there. That mixture went into the hot buttered skillet. Then, over the top went a simple cornbread batter poured carefully so it spread evenly, into a 400-degree oven for 25 minutes. What came out was extraordinary in its modesty. The cornbread baked up golden on top and slightly custardy where it met the beef layer, absorbing just enough of the savory juices below to flavor every bite from the bottom up. You served it in wedges right from the skillet, which meant nobody had to wait for a serving plate to make the rounds. That skillet went straight to the center of the table. Everyone leaned in. 19. Stuffed green peppers. If there was a recipe that made ground beef look like it was trying its best to be something elegant, it was the stuffed green pepper. Set upright in the baking dish, filled to overflowing, glossy with tomato sauce. They looked like something from a restaurant, which was exactly the point. This was company food made on a family budget, and it fooled everyone who didn't know better. The fill-in was the conversation. Some women used plain cooked rice. Some used leftover rice from the night before. Some added Worcestershire sauce for depth. Some stirred in a beaten egg to bind it. Some tucked a cube of cheese in the center so it melted into the middle like a hidden reward. The tomato sauce on top was sometimes homemade. More often, a can of tomato soup poured straight over because the oven would do the rest. They baked for an hour at 350 degrees. The peppers softened and sweetened as they cooked, their bitterness mellowing into something almost fruity against the savory filling. The tops browned just slightly. When you put one on a plate and cut into it, the steam came up with that smell. Beef, rice, sweet pepper, tomato, and for a moment, it didn't matter what anything cost. It mattered that it was good. It was. We're halfway through. And if you grew up in a kitchen where the budget was tight but the table was never empty, keep watching. Because the recipes still ahead include a few that haven't been talked about in 50 years. Number 7 especially, most people under 60 have never even heard of it. 18. Hamburger vegetable soup. This was the soup that appeared in October and didn't leave until March. Every mother had her own rhythm for it. The order things went in, the vegetables she always used, the ones she substituted when the grocery money was short. But the result was always the same. A pot of something deeply warming, thick with vegetables, fragrant with beef, ready when you needed it. Ground beef went in first, browned and broken down fine. Then came the onion, the celery, the carrots, the holy three of the American soup pot, canned tomatoes, diced potatoes, whatever else was in the refrigerator that wouldn't ruin the whole thing. Corn, green beans, cabbage cut into rough pieces. A long pour of beef broth, salt and pepper and thyme. It cooked for an hour, sometimes 2 if the afternoon allowed it. By the time it was done, the potatoes had thickened the broth slightly, and the vegetables had given everything they had to the liquid around them. You ladled it into bowls and set out the bread, and supper was done. Warming, filling, wholesome in the truest sense of that word. The kind of meal that made you feel cared for without anyone having to say so out loud. 17. Beef and rice skillet. Long before convenience products showed up in a yellow box with a cartoon on the front, home cooks were making their own version of beef and rice in a single skillet, and doing it better. The principle was the same. Cook the rice directly in the beefy liquid so it absorbed every bit of flavor rather than sitting blandly alongside it. The execution was simpler than anyone remembers. Brown the ground beef with onion and garlic powder. Add long-grain white rice, uncooked, and stir it around in the beef fat for a minute so the grains toasted slightly and wouldn't turn to mush. Then in went beef broth, or water with a bouillon cube, enough to cover everything by about an inch, a can of diced tomatoes, salt and pepper. The lid went on and the heat went low. 20 minutes later, the rice had absorbed everything. The grains were separate and tender, flavored all the way through with beef and tomato, each one carrying the whole dish in miniature. It looked simple in the bowl, and it was, but it tasted complete in a way that took some cooks years of more complicated meals to understand. Sometimes 1 pan and 4 ingredients is all you ever needed. 16. Ground beef chili. Every family had a chili recipe, and every family was convinced theirs was the right one. The Texas contingent insisted no beans. The Midwest said beans were non-negotiable. The Southwest added green chilies. The North stirred in a square of dark chocolate near the end, which sounded wrong and tasted exactly right. The debates were endless and affectionate, and mostly settled at the dinner table where the chili spoke for itself. What they all had in common was ground beef browned until it was genuinely brown. Not gray, not just cooked through, but properly caramelized in places, and a spice blend that went beyond chili powder into cumin, paprika, oregano, a little cayenne if the children would tolerate it, canned tomatoes and tomato paste for the body, kidney beans if you were in the beans camp, low heat and a long simmer because chili doesn't get better fast. It gets better slowly. The best bowls were the next day's bowls. That was universally agreed upon. The flavors had time to settle into each other overnight, and what had been good the first evening became remarkable by noon the following day. Topped with shredded cheddar, a spoonful of sour cream, crackers crumbled over the top. Chili was never just dinner, it was a point of pride. 15. Mock lasagna. Real lasagna required wide noodles, multiple cheeses, a meat sauce that cooked for hours, and a patience most weeknight cooks couldn't afford. Mock lasagna required egg noodles, ground beef, cottage cheese, and the understanding that the difference between a great meal and a perfect meal was mostly a matter of having enough time. Most families couldn't tell the difference. Most didn't try. You layered it like the real thing, more or less. Cooked egg noodles on the bottom of the casserole dish, then a layer of browned ground beef in tomato sauce. From a jar or a can, nobody judged. Then spoonfuls of cottage cheese dotted across the meat layer, because ricotta was expensive and cottage cheese melted into something nearly indistinguishable once it baked. Then another layer of noodles, more sauce, mozzarella on top. 40 minutes covered, 10 minutes uncovered, and the cheese on top went golden and bubbly and slightly brown at the edges. When you cut into it, the layers held, not perfectly, not like something from an Italian grandmother's kitchen, but well enough that children asked for seconds and husbands didn't know what they were missing, which was the whole point of mock lasagna. You got 90% of the joy for 40% of the effort. 14. Cowboy beans and beef. This was ranch food that found its way into suburban kitchens and stayed. Part stew, part side dish, part main event, cowboy beans and beef occupied a comfortable middle ground that meant nobody could complain they weren't full enough. It was made in a heavy pot, served in deep bowls, and eaten with the kind of appetite that comes from a full day of actual work. Pinto beans, soaked overnight if you were organized, canned if you weren't, went into the pot with browned ground beef, diced onion, canned tomatoes, a good pour of barbecue sauce, brown sugar, dry mustard, and enough beef broth to make it looser than baked beans but thicker than soup. It cooked low and slow until the beans had absorbed the smoky, sweet, beefy liquid, and the whole thing had reduced to a consistency that coated the back of a spoon. Served over white rice or alongside cornbread, This was a meal that asked nothing of you except to sit down and eat it. Cowboy food wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was trying to keep people fed and satisfied through whatever came next. It did that job without complaint every single time. 13. Beef and cabbage soup. Cabbage has been feeding people through hard times for so long that nobody even thinks of it as a hardship food anymore. It's just a vegetable, sturdy, inexpensive, willing to become whatever the pot around it needs it to be. In this soup, it became something sweet and tender, entirely transformed from the raw, sharp thing it started as into something that tasted like it had been there all along. Brown the beef fine, so it dispersed through the broth rather than sitting in chunks. Onion, garlic if you had it, diced tomatoes, beef broth, and then the cabbage. Cut into rough squares and added in the last 30 minutes so it didn't cook completely to mush. A little vinegar near the end brightened everything. Some families added a spoonful of sugar to balance it. Some didn't. Both were right. What made this soup particularly useful was that it cost almost nothing and made a full pot. A full
Now,
pot
sprinkle
meant
in the
dinner
minced
tonight,
parsley.
lunch tomorrow, and maybe dinner again the night after that, the flavor improving each time it came back to temperature. Cabbage soup wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable.
Trust me, this isn't
and
your average
reliability
cabbage
has its
soup.
own kind of
Smoky,
beauty when you're
hearty,
trying to
and
make a
full
week's
of deep
worth of
flavor
meals
in
from a
every
modest
spoonful.
budget. 12. Beef taco skillet. Mexican food arrived in Middle American kitchens in the 1960s, mostly by way of old El Paso products and a growing sense that dinner didn't have to be the same 7 things in rotation forever. The taco skillet was how cautious cooks tested those waters. All the flavors of taco night, none of the assembly, everything made in one pan and put on the table in 25 minutes. Ground beef went in with taco seasoning, though plenty of women made their own blend: chili powder, cumin, garlic powder, a little oregano. In went canned tomatoes, drained black beans, frozen corn. The whole thing simmered down until it was thick and fragrant, then got topped with shredded cheddar right in the skillet, and the lid put back on for 2 minutes so the cheese melted into a soft blanket across the top. Served over rice, or scooped up with tortilla chips, or just eaten straight from a bowl with sour cream on top, the taco skillet was the gateway through which a generation of American home cooks discovered that spice wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something to be grateful for. It made everything taste more alive. 13 down, 12 to go. And we are about to get into the ones that really go back. The recipes that women in their 80s still make from memory, without measuring anything, because the proportions are built into their hands. Number 7 is unlike anything else on this list. Stay with us. 11. Beef stroganoff. The original. Before it came in a box, before the powdered packets and the shortcut versions that tasted fine but never quite right, beef stroganoff was a proper dish, one that a certain kind of 1950s and 60s home cook made with real pride. It came from the Russian aristocracy, filtered through mid-century American cooking magazines, and landed in suburban kitchens as the dish you made when you wanted dinner to feel like an occasion, even on a Wednesday. Ground beef was the practical substitution for the sliced beef tenderloin in the original recipe, and it worked beautifully. You browned the beef with onion and mushrooms. Fresh mushrooms, not canned. This was one place cooks didn't cut corners. Then deglaze the pan with a little beef broth, added a spoonful of Dijon mustard, and at the very end stirred in sour cream off the heat so it wouldn't curdle. Over egg noodles, always egg noodles. The sour cream turned the whole thing silky and slightly tangy in a way that made everyone pause after the first bite and think about what they were eating. It was comfort food with a little sophistication around its edges. The kind of meal that made the dining room table worth setting properly, even on a weeknight, even when nobody was coming over. You said it properly because the food deserved it. 10. Beef and potato hash. Saturday morning. Hash was one of those rituals that organized an entire week around it. The hash was made on Saturdays because that's when there were leftovers from the week worth using. Potatoes from Thursday, maybe. Beef from Friday. And because Saturday mornings were the ones where nobody had to rush anywhere, and the smell of something good cooking in a cast-iron skillet could drift through every room in the house. Diced cooked potatoes went into the hot, lightly oiled skillet first, left alone long enough to develop a crust on the bottom before being turned. Then the ground beef, already browned, went in with diced onion and green pepper. Everything got pressed down flat with the back of a spatula and left to cook until the bottom layer was genuinely crispy. Not just warm through, but crispy. Then it got turned in sections, roughly, not perfectly, and left again. A fried egg on top was optional but felt mandatory. The yolk broken over the hash, running down into the crevices between the potato and beef, was the thing that turned breakfast into something people talked about later in the day. Not because it was elaborate. 9. Meatball stew. The meatball and the stew were two separate traditions that somebody eventually decided belonged together, and they were absolutely right. Meatball stew was the kind of thing that simmered all afternoon on a Sunday and made the whole house smell like somewhere you wanted to stay. It was patient food, the kind that rewarded you for not rushing it. The meatballs were made small, smaller than you'd make for spaghetti, about the size of a large marble, so they cooked through quickly and didn't fall apart in the stew. Ground beef, breadcrumbs, a little egg, salt and pepper rolled firm. They got browned in batches in a heavy pot, then set aside while the vegetables went in: onion, carrots, celery, potatoes cut in chunks, beef broth, canned tomatoes, a bay leaf. The meatballs went back in for the last 30 minutes, nestled in the broth among the vegetables, finishing their cooking there and flavoring everything around them as they did. The broth, by the end, was rich and slightly thickened, full of the starch from the potatoes and the depth from the meatballs. Ladled into wide bowls with a thick slice of white bread alongside, this was Sunday dinner done right. No argument possible. 8. Porcupine meatballs. The name stopped everyone the first time they heard it, which was exactly why it worked so well for getting children to the table. No actual porcupines were involved. The name came from the uncooked rice mixed directly into the ground beef, which poked out during cooking like tiny quills. It was charming and a little absurd, and absolutely delicious, which is a combination that's hard to beat. You mixed ground beef with raw, long-grain white rice, minced onion, salt, pepper, and a little Worcestershire sauce. The mixture got rolled into balls, not too tight or they wouldn't cook through, and placed in a baking dish. Over them you poured a sauce made from tomato soup thinned with water, which would both bake the meatballs and cook the rice from the inside out. Covered tightly into a 350-degree oven for an hour and 15 minutes. What came out was genuinely remarkable. The rice had absorbed the tomato liquid and expanded through the meat, creating a texture unlike any other meatball, almost fluffy inside with the quill-like rice grains poking through the exterior just as promised. The tomato sauce had reduced to something thick and glossy around them. Children who refused to eat anything unfamiliar ate these without complaint. It helped that they looked like something from a storybook. 7. Beef rissoles. Here is the one that most people under 60 have never heard of: beef rissoles. The dish that was standard enough in American homes through the 1950s to appear in mainstream cooking magazines and ladies' club cookbooks from coast to coast, and then disappeared so completely that mentioning the name today draws blank looks from most people who didn't grow up eating them. A rissole is ground beef mixed with onion, herbs, and breadcrumbs, formed into a patty or oval, then coated in breadcrumbs and pan-fried in butter until the crust is deep golden brown and audibly crispy. Not a hamburger, not a meatball, something older, closer to the croquette tradition that European immigrants brought with them and that American home cooks adapted into their own kitchens. The butter was non-negotiable. Shortening didn't give you that crust. They were served with brown gravy made from the pan drippings, poured over the top at the table. Alongside mashed potatoes and canned peas, this was a meal that looked far more deliberate than it was. The golden crust, the glossy gravy, the steam coming up. If you made these, you knew what you were doing. The recipe is worth finding again. Some things disappear for no good reason, and this is one of them. 6. Beef and dumpling stew. Drop dumplings made from scratch took 10 minutes to prepare and transformed a pot of ordinary beef stew into something that felt like a celebration. That was the magic of them. The effort was minimal and the effect was enormous. Women who made this on cold November nights understood something fundamental about comfort, that it isn't complicated, it's just warm and it fills you up. The stew base was straightforward. Browned ground beef, onion, carrots, celery, potatoes, beef broth, salt and pepper, a long simmer until the vegetables were tender. The dumplings were flour, baking powder, salt, and milk stirred together into a shaggy batter. Not smooth, not kneaded, just barely combined, and dropped by spoonfuls onto the surface of the simmering stew. The lid went on and didn't come off for 15 minutes. No peeking. The steam was doing the work. The dumplings puffed up into soft, pillowy rounds, cooked through on the inside with a slightly glossy exterior where they'd touch the broth. Each one carried the flavor of the stew inside it. You served it in deep bowls, 1 or 2 dumplings per person, and the bowl had to be deep enough to hold the broth. People were quiet while they ate this, not because there was nothing to say, because eating it was the whole point. 5. Shepherd's pie, American style. The original shepherd's pie was British and made with lamb. The American version used ground beef and called itself whatever it wanted, because that's what American cooking has always done with borrowed recipes, taken the idea and made it fit the pantry. It spread through American kitchens in the post-war years and settled in as one of those dishes that every family made slightly differently, but that everyone recognized immediately. The beef layer was seasoned ground beef browned with onion, mixed with whatever vegetables the family would eat. Corn was popular, so were peas and carrots, and bound with a little beef broth or gravy. Into a baking dish it went. On top came the mashed potatoes, spread thick and smooth all the way to the edges so no steam could escape during baking, then cross-hatched with a fork to create ridges that would brown. 40 minutes in the oven at 375 degrees, and the potato top went golden at the ridges, the filling bubbling up slightly at the edges, the whole thing smelling like Sunday dinner. Breaking through that potato crust into the beef and vegetable layer below was a small ceremony, the kind that families repeat without thinking about it, until one day someone notices they've been doing the same thing their whole lives, and they feel the rightness of it all at once. 4. Beef stuffed baked potatoes. A baked potato was already a meal. Loading it with seasoned ground beef made it an event. This was the recipe that stretched 4 potatoes and half a pound of beef into dinner for 4 adults without anyone feeling like they'd been shortchanged, because a loaded baked potato feels inherently generous. The size of it, the way it sits on the plate, the business of adding your own toppings.
Them in the oven, we need to poke a few holes. Grab a spud, grab your fork, and poke a few holes. The internet says that by doing this, it prevents...
While they baked, ground beef went into a skillet with onion, a little tomato paste, Worcestershire sauce, salt and pepper, cooked down into a thick, saucy mixture that held together when you spooned it. The potatoes came out, were split and fluffed with a fork, and the beef mixture went over the top, followed by shredded cheddar and sour cream. This was one of those rare dishes where every element was good on its own and extraordinary together.
Nice and melty. Once they're out of the oven, sprinkle the tops with the chopped chives and enjoy.
Beef,
now that's a stuffed twice baked potato. I like to eat mine with a giant blob of sour cream on top. It's so good, I'm drooling right now. You can't see it, but believe it, I'm definitely drooling. Here's some ingredient tips to share. Drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and if you like
3. Beef, vegetable hand pies. These were the portable version of everything good about beef stew, wrapped in pastry and made small enough to hold in one hand. Hand pies went to picnics, church suppers, school lunches wrapped in wax paper, potlucks where you wanted to bring something that would disappear fast. They were the kind of food that said someone had taken real care, because pastry takes real care, and that care was worth something. The filling was simple. Ground beef browned with onion and diced carrot, a little flour stirred in to thicken it, beef broth added and reduced until the mixture was moist but not wet, salt, pepper, maybe a little thyme. The pastry was a basic pie crust. Lard made it flaky in a way that shortening couldn't quite match, rolled out and cut into circles. A spoonful of filling in the center, edges crimped shut, a slit cut in the top. They baked at 375 degrees until golden, about 25 minutes. The pastry shattered slightly when you bit into it, releasing steam, and the filling was dense and savory and exactly right. You could eat one standing up at the kitchen counter and feel like you'd been properly fed. That's the standard all food should be held to, whether you can eat it standing up and feel properly fed. 2. Salisbury steak with brown gravy. Named after Dr. James Salisbury, who in the 1880s believed ground beef was the foundation of a healthy diet, Salisbury steak became something far more than its origins. By the mid-20th century, it was a staple of the American dinner table. A proper dish, not a shortcut, something women made deliberately on nights when they wanted dinner to feel like dinner and not just fuel. The beef got mixed with breadcrumbs soaked in milk until they were paste soft, a beaten egg, Worcestershire sauce, mustard, salt and pepper, the additions that turned plain ground beef into something with actual texture and depth. Formed into oval patties thick enough to stay juicy. Seared in a hot skillet until genuinely brown on both sides, then set aside while the gravy got built in the same pan, sliced onions cooked in the drippings until caramelized, flour stirred in, beef broth added slowly, whisked smooth. The patties went back into the gravy for 15 minutes of slow simmering, finishing their cooking in that rich, dark, onion-sweet liquid. Served over mashed potatoes with the gravy pooled around everything, this was the meal that turned an ordinary Tuesday into something people remembered. Not because it was special occasion food, because it was made with enough care that it tasted like someone thought you deserved a real dinner. You did. You always did. 1. Meatloaf. Of course it's meatloaf. It was always going to be meatloaf. No dish in the American ground beef canon has been more made, more debated, more loved, or more unfairly maligned by people who clearly never had a good one. Meatloaf at its best is extraordinary. A thing unto itself, nothing else like it, deserving of its place at the very top of this list. The recipe that deserves to be called the best is the one that doesn't rush. Ground beef, not too lean, 80-20 is right, mixed with diced onion that's been sautéed first so it's soft and sweet, not raw and sharp. Breadcrumbs soaked in milk. 2 eggs. Worcestershire sauce, dry mustard, salt, pepper, mixed with your hands, gently, because overworking it makes it dense, and that's the mistake most people make only once. into a loaf pan shaped into a rounded mound. The glaze on top was the signature of every cook who made it. Ketchup mixed with brown sugar and a little vinegar, brushed on thick. Into a 350-degree oven for an hour and 15 minutes. The glaze caramelized and cracked slightly on top, and the interior stayed juicy because of all that milk-soaked bread. Let it rest 10 minutes before slicing or it falls apart. Another thing you only learn by making the mistake. Every family had a version. Every family believed their version was the right one. Every family was correct. Because meatloaf isn't really a recipe, it's a record. A record of every woman who ever stood at a kitchen counter on a weeknight with a pound of ground beef and the responsibility of feeding people she loved, and did it without fuss, without complaint, without anyone outside those four walls ever knowing how much it took. Meatloaf is what love looks like when love has to feed 6 people on $12. And it is, and always was, worth every bite. If any of these brought something back, a kitchen you used to stand in, a smell you haven't thought about in years, a woman who fed you without ever making a fuss about it, leave it in the comments. Tell us what she made. Someone else, watching this right now, grew up eating the same thing, and they'd love to know they're not the only one.